The wind in the Texas Panhandle did not just blow, it scoured. It possessed a grit that found its way into the seams of the tightest boots and settled in the lines around a woman's eyes, aging her before her time. In the summer of 1874, the wind felt less like air and more like the breath of an open oven, baking the Llano Estacado until the earth cracked and pleaded for rain that refused to fall. Clara May Harper sat by the only window in the trading post that still had all its glass, a needle flashing in her hand. She was 24 years old, though there were mornings when she felt closer to 50. She had the kind of beauty that did not beg for attention, a stillness in her features. Dark hair pulled back severely to keep the dust out, and eyes the color of day-old coffee that had seen enough of the world to expect very little from it. She pulled the thread taut, biting the end with her teeth. It was a simple calico shirt belonging to one of the trappers who passed through, a man who smelled of uncured hide and cheap whiskey. He would pay her 50 cents for the mending, and that 50 cents would go into the tin box beneath her cot. It was not a fortune. But in this corner of the world, survival was not built on fortunes. It was built on the accumulation of small, hard things. "You are going to ruin your eyes, Mrs. Harper," a voice said, smooth as oil sliding over a hot skillet. Clara did not jump. She finished her knot before looking up. Silas Crow stood near the counter, leaning against a barrel of salted pork as if he owned it, along with the rest of the store. He was a man who dressed too well for the dust, wearing a suit that cost more than the trading post made in 6 months. He claimed to be a land speculator, sometimes a railroad agent, depending on who was asking. "My eyes are fine, Mr. Crow," Clara said, her voice even. "The light is good enough." Crow smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. They were pale, the color of a winter sky, and completely devoid of warmth. He tapped his fingers on the wooden counter, a rhythmic, irritating sound. "You have a talent for precision. Clara, I noticed it when you handle the ledger. You notice things other people miss. Numbers, discrepancies." "I just write down what gets sold and what gets bought," Clara replied, picking up her scissors. "Flour, beans, ammunition. There is no magic in it. And the telegraph." Crow took a step closer. "You hear the wire singing better than the operator. I hear Old Man Whitaker says you can translate the clicks faster than he can write them down." Clara felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. The telegraph line had been strung up to the post only 3 months ago, a copper thread stitching the wild territory to the civilized world back east. Most people looked at it with suspicion, but Clara had learned its language quickly. It was a series of long and short sounds, a mechanical heartbeat that carried news of wars, prices, and orders. "Mr. Whitaker talks too much when he has had his evening brandy," Clara said, turning back to her sewing. "Perhaps, but information is valuable currency out here, Mrs. Harper, more valuable than gold. Sometimes, if you ever hear anything interesting about land surveys or troop movements, I would be a generous friend. I'm a seamstress and a clerk, Mr. Crow. I do not traffic in secrets." Crow watched her for a long moment, his smile tight. "Everyone traffics in something. My dear, you will learn that eventually." He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt more like a threat than a courtesy, and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun. Clara watched him go, letting out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She hated men like Crow. They were a different breed of predator than the wolves or the cougars that roamed the canyon. A wolf killed to eat. Men like Crow killed with paper and ink, starving families off their land from 1,000 miles away. She stood up, needing to stretch her legs. The trading post was stiflingly hot, smelling of dry goods, tobacco, and sweat. She walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the glare. The trading post sat on a rise of land that overlooked a vast, broken plain. To the west, the flat horizon was broken by the jagged scars of the canyons, places where the earth seemed to have collapsed in on itself. It was Comanche country out there. The Quahati band, the last free ones, were still riding, refusing the reservations that had swallowed the other tribes. The town, if one could call a collection of 12 shacks, a saloon, and a livery stable, a town was tense. Clara could feel it in the way the men walked, hands hovering near their hips. There were soldiers from the fort nearby, dusty and bored, drinking alongside buffalo hunters who had wiped the herds from the plains and were now looking for something else to shoot. "Did you hear?" A voice drifted from the porch of the saloon next door. $3,000 for the scalp of a chief. Government prices. "I heard they are gathering at the canyon," another man replied, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt. "We should ride out. Burn them out before they raid us." Clara tightened her grip on the porch railing. Rumors. They flew around the territory like the red dust, blinding everyone. There had been no raids in weeks, but fear did not need facts to grow. It only needed a whisper. She looked out toward the horizon, seeking the emptiness that usually calmed her. But the horizon was not empty. Far out, perhaps 2 miles away, a figure sat on a horse on a ridge. At this distance, he was nothing more than a silhouette cut from black paper against the burning blue sky. He was not moving. He was simply watching. Clara squinted. It was not a soldier. The posture was too relaxed, too at one with the animal beneath him. It was not a cowboy. There was no hat. It was a Comanche. He sat there for a long time, as still as the rocks around him. There was something unnerving about his stillness. It was not the stillness of a statue, but the stillness of a hawk circling on a thermal, waiting for the precise moment to fold its wings and dive. She felt a strange pull, a curiosity that overrode her fear. Who was he? Was he a scout, a warrior looking for a fight, or was he just a man watching the encroachment of a world that wanted him dead? His name, though she did not know it then, was Tuhuya Redhawk, and even from 2 miles away, his presence felt like a weight on the air, heavier than the heat. "What are you looking at, Mrs. Harper?" Clara started, turning to find Dr. Miller stepping up onto the porch. He was a kind man, usually drunk by noon, but a capable surgeon when sober. "Nothing," Clara lied, glancing back at the ridge. The figure was gone. The horizon was empty again, as if he had been a mirage conjured by the heat waves. "Just the heat. It is a brutal one," Dr. Miller agreed, wiping his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "There are going to be a lot of heat stroke cases if this keeps up, and gunshot wounds. The temper of this town is getting short." "Silas Crow is asking questions again," Clara said quietly. Dr. Miller frowned. "That man is a vulture. He smells death before the body is cold. Stay away from him." "Clara." "I'll try," she said. "But he is everywhere." She went back inside. The image of the rider on the ridge burned into her mind. She tried to focus on her work, organizing the shelves of canned peaches and coffee, but her hands felt restless. Later that afternoon, the telegraph key began to chatter. Click, clack, click, clack. Clara was behind the counter, weighing out a pound of sugar for a farmer's wife. The sound was automatic background noise to most, but to Clara, the rhythmic tapping formed words in her head. Shipment, delayed, route changes, Palo Duro. She paused, her hand hovering over the scale. Secure the canyon, railroad interest, terminate obstacles. It was a message for the fort, or perhaps for someone else. It was not the usual order for supplies. Terminate obstacles was a sterile way of saying killing. "Mrs. Harper," the farmer's wife asked. "Is something wrong?" Clara blinked. No, I am sorry. Just lost in thought." She finished weighing the sugar, her heart beating a little faster. The telegraph was supposed to connect people, but out here, it felt like an invisible noose, slowly tightening around the neck of the territory. It brought orders from men in velvet chairs in Washington and New York, men who had never seen the blood soak into the dry dirt of Texas, but felt entitled to own it. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long, bruised shadows across the dirt street, Mr. Whitaker came out of the back room. He was a stout man with a red face and a permanent expression of concern. "Clara," he said, holding a heavy leather satchel. The stagecoach has thrown a wheel 5 miles east. The driver sent a rider ahead. They cannot make it in until tomorrow." "That is unfortunate," Clara said, wiping the counter. "It is worse than unfortunate. This mailbag needs to go out to the junction tonight. The night rider comes through at the crossroads at 8 o'clock. If this bag is not there, it sits here for another week. And I have the updated ledger for the supply master." He looked at her with pleading eyes. Clara sighed. She knew what was coming. "You want me to take the buckboard out to the crossroads?" she stated. "I cannot leave the post," Whitaker said, spreading his hands. "And I do not trust the boys at the livery. They will get drunk and lose the mail or steal the packages. You are the only one I trust. Clara, it is just 6 miles out and back. You will be home before full dark." Clara looked at the satchel. It was heavy, worn leather, smelling of sweat and horses. Inside were letters from mothers to sons, orders for new plows, maybe a love letter or two, the mundane paper trail of human lives. "All right," she said, "but I am taking the repeater rifle." Of course, Whitaker said, relieved. "Take whatever you need." Clara went to her room at the back of the store. She changed her shoes for sturdy boots and put on a heavy canvas coat despite the heat. The evenings could turn cold rapidly, and the coat offered a layer of protection against the brush. She checked the Winchester rifle, sliding the lever to ensure the action was smooth. She loaded it, counting the rounds, 7. She walked out to the stable and hitched the old mare, Bess, to the small buckboard wagon. The horse was steady, not fast, which suited Clara fine. She tossed the mailbag and the ledger book under the seat, covering them with a blanket. As she climbed up and took the reins, she looked toward the saloon. Silas Crow was standing on the boardwalk, smoking a thin cigar. He watched her preparing to leave, his eyes narrowing slightly. He did not wave, he just watched, like a spider feeling a vibration in its web. Clara snapped the reins, and the buckboard jerked forward. "Giddy up, Bess!" They rolled out of the settlement, the wheels crunching over the hard-packed earth. The noise of the town faded quickly, replaced by the immense, overwhelming silence of the plains. The sun was sinking, turning the sky into a violent bruise of purple and orange. To her left, the land stretched out flat and endless. To her right, the terrain grew rougher, rising toward the rocky outcrops and the hidden canyons. About 2 miles out, Clara saw movement. A herd of wild mustangs was running parallel to the wagon. There were perhaps 20 of them, their coats painted with the colors of the earth roan, chestnut, dun. They ran with a fluid grace that made the domestic mare pulling Clara's wagon look clumsy and broken. They were fast, powerful, and utterly indifferent to her existence. Clara watched them, a lump forming in her throat. They were beautiful. They were freedom in its purest form, running across the land without fences, without masters, without ledgers or telegraphs. "Run," she whispered to them. "Run while you still can." She thought of the telegraph message she had overheard. Terminate obstacles. Were the horses obstacles? Was the man she had seen on the ridge an obstacle? Was she, with her desire for a quiet life, an obstacle? The horses veered away, disappearing into a fold of the land, leaving only a cloud of dust hanging in the twilight. Clara turned her attention back to the road. The crossroads was another hour away. The shadows were stretching long now, reaching out like fingers trying to grab the wheels of the wagon. She felt a strange unease settling in her stomach. It was a routine errand. She had done it a dozen times before, but tonight felt different. The air felt charged, heavy with electricity, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. She touched the stock of the rifle resting on the seat beside her. She was a woman alone in a land that did not forgive weakness. She had learned to be hard because soft things did not last in the panhandle. As the wagon crested a small rise, the sun finally slipped below the horizon, plunging the world into the gray half-light of dusk. The road ahead dipped into a dry wash, a place where flash floods would roar through during the spring rains. Now, it was just a depression in the earth, shadowed and quiet. Too quiet. Clara tightened her grip on the reins. Her instincts, honed by 3 years of widowhood and frontier living, pricked at her. The birds had stopped singing. The cicadas were silent. She urged Bess forward, wanting to get through the low ground quickly. "Come on, girl, step up." The wagon rattled down into the wash, and that was when the ordinary day ended, and the nightmare began. It happened with the suddenness of a lightning strike. There was a crack, not thunder, but the sharp, flat report of a rifle. Splinters exploded from the side of the wagon box, inches from Clara's hip. Bess screamed, rearing up in panic. "Whoa!" Clara yelled, fighting the reins, but another shot rang out, and the horse stumbled, dropping to its knees with a sickening thud. The wagon lurched violently, throwing Clara sideways. She didn't think, she reacted. She grabbed the mailbag and the rifle, tucking her body into a roll as she hit the dirt. The ground was as hard as iron. Pain shot through her shoulder, but adrenaline washed it away instantly. "Get the bags!" a voice shouted from the ridge above. It was a rough voice, speaking English. Clara scrambled on her hands and knees, dragging herself under the cover of the fallen horse and the tilted wagon. Dust was choking the air. She could hear boots running down the slope, heavy boots, crushing the brush. She pressed her back against the dead mare, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She cocked the lever of her Winchester. Not Comanche, she thought, her mind racing with a cold, crystalline clarity. Comanche do not shout in English before they attack, and they do not miss the driver. She peered through the spokes of the wagon wheel. 3 men were sliding down the embankment. They wore dusters and had scarves pulled up over their faces. But as one of them jumped the last few feet, the scarf slipped slightly around his neck. Catching the last faint light of the dusk was a glimmer of brass. A badge, no. A medallion. A circular piece of brass stamped with a letter. "See?" Clara's breath hitched. She had seen a medallion like that before. It was a paperweight on the desk of Silas Crow. These were not bandits. These were employees. "Check the girl," one of them growled. "Make sure she is dead. The boss said there were no witnesses." Clara raised the rifle, aiming through the wheel spokes. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to still. She was Clara May Harper. She had buried her husband. She had survived droughts and blizzards. She would not die in a dry wash for the sake of Silas Crow's greed. But before she could pull the trigger, a new sound cut through the chaos. It was not a gunshot. It was the whistle of an arrow slicing through the air. The lead attacker, the one with the brass medallion, suddenly jerked backward, an arrow sprouting from his shoulder. He howled, dropping his gun. "Indians," he screamed. "It is a trap." The other 2 men spun around, firing wildly into the darkness of the ridge on the opposite side. Clara looked up. On the rim of the wash, outlined against the first stars of the evening, was a figure on a horse. He held a bow, drawn and ready. It was the shadow from the horizon. It was Tuhuya. He was not a shadow now. He was a force of nature, descending into the wash with a war cry that chilled the blood and ignited a spark of desperate hope in Clara's chest. The West was indeed a place where the ordinary could turn into destiny in the blink of an eye. And as the Comanche warrior charged, Clara knew that her life, her quiet, safe, lonely life was over. Whatever happened next, if she lived through the next 5 minutes, she would never be just a seamstress again. The chaotic eruption of violence in the dry wash did not resemble the stories Clara had read in the dime novels Mr. Whitaker kept on the bottom shelf. There was no glory in it, only a deafening confusion of noise and the acrid taste of dust mixed with gun smoke. Clara lay flattened beneath the splintered bulk of the wagon, her cheek pressed against the cooling flank of poor Bess. The mare was dead, a heavy, inert mound of horseflesh that offered the only shield against the bullets chewing up the earth around them, above the ringing in her ears. Clara heard the shouts of the men, the attackers who had spoken English. "Flank him! Get the savage!" one voice screamed, raw with panic. Clara turned her head, her eyes stinging from the grit, from her vantage point on the ground. The world was reduced to a terrifyingly narrow perspective: the wooden spokes of the broken wheel, the dry scrub brush, and the feet of the men fighting above her. It was the feet that made her breath hitch in her throat. She saw a pair of boots stomping through the dust just 3 yards away. They were heavy, leather boots with thick soles, the heels reinforced with iron hobnails. They struck the rocks with a metallic clack-clack-clack that no moccasin would ever make. These were not the footwear of a starving Comanche warrior raiding for horses. These were army-issue cavalry boots. Or at least they had been once, before the leather had worn down and been patched with grease. A second pair of boots joined the first, dropping from the ridge. These were square-toed, worn by a man who moved with the heavy, flat-footed gait of someone used to walking on pavement or floorboards, not the silent tread of a hunter. "Where is the girl?" the second man shouted. "Crow said no witnesses." Clara froze. The name hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. Crow. The man with the hobnailed boots knelt, reloading a revolver. As he turned, his long duster coat flared open. Clara saw his face was covered by a red bandana, but the wind caught the edge of his vest. Pinned there, gleaming dully in the starlight, was a brass medallion. It was not a sheriff's star. It was a simple, circular disc stamped with a heavy, stylized letter C. Recognition flashed through Clara's mind like a physical blow. She had seen that exact medallion sitting on Silas Crow's mahogany desk, used as a paperweight to hold down his railroad contracts. It was a token from the Consolidated Rail Company. These were not bandits. They were hired guns, and they were disguised to look like the very people the town feared most. Suddenly, a rough hand grabbed Clara by the ankle. She screamed, kicking out with her free boot, but the grip was iron. She was dragged out from beneath the wagon, scraping through the dirt and rocks, her coat bunched up around her shoulders as she was hauled into the open air. "Got her," the man with the brass medallion yelled. He yanked her to her feet, twisting her arm behind her back until she gasped in pain. "Hold fire, I have a girl," Clara struggled, spitting dust from her mouth. "Let me go, I know who you are." "That is unfortunate for you, lady," the man growled in her ear. He raised his pistol, pressing the cold barrel against her temple. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She waited for the hammer to fall. She waited for the end. Instead, she heard a sound like a tearing sheet, followed by a wet thud. The man holding her suddenly became rigid. His grip on her arm went slack. He made a choking, gurgling sound and collapsed backward, pulling Clara down with him. Clara scrambled away, crab walking backward on her hands and heels. The man lay on his back, eyes wide and staring at the stars. An arrow with fletching dyed red and black protruded from his throat. She looked up. The Comanche warrior, the one she had called a shadow on the horizon. Was there? He had guided his horse down the steep embankment of the wash with impossible grace and was now wheeling the animal around in a tight circle. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps no older than herself. His chest was bare save for a bone breastplate, and his face was painted with a single black stripe across the eyes. Tuhuya, Red Hawk. He did not look like the monsters in the stories. He looked focused, efficient. The surviving attacker, the one in the square-toed boots, fired 2 wild shots at the mounted warrior. Red Hawk did not flinch. He returned fire, not with another arrow, but with a Winchester rifle he pulled from a scabbard on his saddle. He fired from the hip, the bullet kicking up a geyser of dirt right between the attacker's feet. The hired gun yelped, dropped his weapon, and scrambled up the side of the wash, disappearing into the darkness of the brush. He chose life over the job. Silence rushed back into the canyon, heavy and ringing. Clara sat in the dirt, trembling violently. She looked at the dead man with the brass medallion, then up at the Comanche warrior. She expected him to finish what the others had started. She expected him to take the mailbag, to take her scalp, to take everything. Red Hawk guided his horse closer. The animal snorted, tossing its head, but the rider held it steady. He looked down at Clara. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and devoid of the madness she had been told to expect. He reached down. Clara flinched, raising her hands to protect her face. But he did not strike her. He reached for the leather mailbag that had fallen near her feet. He hooked it with the end of his bow and lifted it, weighing it in his hand. Then, to Clara's utter shock, he dropped it gently into her lap. "This is not ours," he said. Clara stared at him, her mouth falling open. He spoke English. It was accented, the vowels flattened and the rhythm different. But it was clear. You speak," she stammered. "They want to blame us," Red Hawk said. His voice was low, carrying a vibrating intensity. He gestured with his chin toward the dead man in the duster. "Look at his boots. Look at the arrows in the wagon wood. Those are not Quahadi arrows. They are fletched with turkey feathers, clumsily tied. Someone wants a war woman." Clara looked at the wagon. In the panic, she had not noticed. But now she saw 2 arrows sticking out of the wood near the driver's seat. They looked amateurish compared to the deadly precision of the one in the dead man's throat. "Why?" Clara whispered, clutching the mailbag to her chest as if it were a shield. "Why are you helping me?" Red Hawk looked past her, toward the east, where the sound of approaching hoofbeats rumbled against the earth. A lot of hoofbeats. "Because the dead cannot speak," he said. "And if you die, the lie lives." He wheeled his horse around. "Stay down. The blue coats are coming. Do not tell them I was here, or they will kill you to get to me." With a kick of his heels, he sent his horse scrambling up the far bank of the wash. In seconds, he had vanished into the night, swallowed by the shadows of the canyon as if he had never existed. Clara was left alone with a dead horse, a dead murderer, and the truth. She did not have long to process it. The rumble of hooves grew into a roar. Torches flared on the rim of the wash, casting dancing, demonic shadows across the scene. "Down there." "I see the wagon," a voice shouted. A dozen riders poured into the wash. It was a detachment of cavalry from the fort, accompanied by several men from the town. Dust swirled in the torchlight, choking the air. "Mrs. Harper Clara." It was Dr. Miller, sliding off his horse before it had fully stopped. He rushed to her side, his face pale in the flickering light. "My God, Clara, are you hurt? Where are you bleeding?" I'm all right," Clara managed to say, though her voice shook. "Just bruises, scrapes." "We heard shots," a lieutenant said, striding over. He was young, with a mustache that looked too big for his face. He kicked the boot of the dead attacker. "Damn it, look at this." He pointed to the arrow in the man's throat. Then he walked to the wagon and pulled out one of the clumsily made arrows from the wood. "Comanche," the lieutenant declared, holding the arrow up for the men to see, just like the reports. "They are raiding the mail lines." Clara opened her mouth to speak. She wanted to scream that he was wrong. She wanted to point out the hobnailed boots on the dead man, the brass medallion that had conveniently disappeared. Wait. She looked at the dead man's vest. The medallion was gone. Panic cold as ice water washed over her. She looked around the dirt. In the scuffle, when the man fell, the medallion must have torn loose or slipped under him. "This is an act of war," a deep, smooth voice said from the edge of the light. The men parted, and Silas Crow walked his horse forward. He was dressed in a dark riding coat, looking every inch the concerned citizen. He looked down at the scene with a grim satisfaction that made Clara's stomach turn. "Attacking a woman," Crow said, shaking his head. "Stealing government mail. We cannot let this stand. Lieutenant, the town demands protection." Crow's eyes drifted to Clara. They were cold, calculating. He was searching her face, looking for cracks. "Mrs. Harper, you are lucky to be alive. Did you see them? How many were there?" Clara gripped the mailbag tighter. Her mind raced. If she told the lieutenant that the dead man was white, that he wore Crow's medallion, Crow would know she knew. And out here, in the dark, with a dozen confused and angry men, an accidental discharge of a weapon would be very easy to explain. "They want to blame us." Red Hawk's words echoed in her mind. "It was dark," Clara said, her voice trembling. It wasn't entirely a lie. There was dust everywhere. I saw shadows. Crow studied her for a long, agonizing second. Then he smiled, a thin, tight expression. Shadows, yes, the savages are like ghosts, but they leave traces. He turned to the lieutenant. Gather the men. We need to track the rest of the war party before the wind covers their trail. As the men began to mill about, shouting orders and securing the horses, Clara shifted her position. Her hand brushed against something in the dirt near the dead man's boot. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper, scorched on one edge as if it had been used to light a pipe or had fallen from a burning pocket. She glanced around. Dr. Miller was busy checking the dead man's pulse, a futility, but a habit. The lieutenant was arguing with his sergeant. Crow was mounting his horse, his back to her. Clara snatched the paper and shoved it into the pocket of her canvas coat. Come, Clara, Dr. Miller said, helping her stand. We need to get you back to town. You are in shock. The ride back to the trading post was a blur of pain and exhaustion. Clara rode behind Dr. Miller, her arms wrapped around his waist, her head resting against his back. Every jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of aching through her shoulder, but her mind was sharper than it had ever been. When they arrived at the post, the town was already awake. News traveled faster than horses. Faces peered from windows. Men stood on porches with shotguns. The fear was palpable, a living thing that smelled of sweat and hysteria. Get her inside, Whitaker said, ushering them into the back room of the store. He looked 10 years older than he had that afternoon. I never should have sent you. Clara, I never should have sent you. I am fine. Mr. Whitaker, Clara said, sitting on the edge of her cot. Her hands were shaking as she unbuttoned her coat. Dr. Miller cleaned the scrape on her cheek with alcohol. You need rest. Clara, no work tomorrow. I will tell Whitaker. Thank you, doctor, she said. Eventually, they left her alone. The door clicked shut, and the heavy bolt slid into place. Only then did Clara reach into her pocket. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the crumpled scrap of paper. She smoothed it out on her quilt. It was a fragment of a telegraph form, the kind used at the railway offices. The paper was yellowed and brittle. One edge was black with soot. Written on it in pencil were a series of letters and numbers. It was not plain English. XV2, PDC, load. NOON. Burn. Clara stared at it. Most people would see gibberish, but Clara had spent months listening to the wire, and she had spent 3 years deciphering the scribbled notes Silas Crow sent to the trading post for supplies. Crow used a simple substitution cipher for his sensitive business dealings. He shifted letters by 3 places. PDC, Palo Duro Canyon, burn. That was clear enough. And the first part, XV2, 17 a date, or a time. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This paper had been in the pocket of the man who tried to kill her. The man with the railway medallion. It was instructions. Load at noon. Burn. They were planning something at Palo Duro Canyon, and they were going to make it look like the Comanches did it. Clara brought her hand to her mouth. She held the proof of a conspiracy that could ignite a war across the entire panhandle. If she took this to the lieutenant, would he believe her, or was he on Crow's payroll too? The man with the medallion had acted with the confidence of someone who knew the law would look the other way. If she stayed silent, Red Hawk and his people would be hunted down and slaughtered for a crime they did not commit. If she spoke, she was a dead woman. Crow would burn the trading post to the ground with her inside it to keep this secret. Squeak. The sound of a floorboard creaking in the main store made Clara freeze. She blew out the oil lamp instantly, plunging the room into darkness. She sat perfectly still, holding her breath. She heard the soft, stealthy shuffle of feet. Someone was in the store. Not Mr. Whitaker. He walked with a heavy limp. This was someone trying to be quiet. They were coming toward her room. Crow. He suspected she had seen something. Or maybe the man who ran away had told him about the paper. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked around the dark room frantically. Where could she hide it under the mattress? Too obvious. In the tin box. The first place a thief would look. She felt the fabric of her dress, the hem, working by touch alone, her fingers flying with the dexterity of 1,000 mended shirts. Clara grabbed her small sewing scissors from the nightstand. She snipped the thread of the hem on her skirt, creating a small pocket between the layers of fabric. She folded the burnt paper into a tiny square and slid it deep inside the hem. She grabbed a needle and thread, making 3 quick, crude stitches to seal it shut just as the doorknob to her room slowly began to turn. It was locked, but the lock was flimsy. Clara lay back on the pillow, feigning sleep, her hand gripping the revolver she kept beneath her blanket. The knob turned again, then stopped. Outside, on the street, the sound of a horse snorting broke the silence. "Crow!" a voice called out from the darkness outside. "Sheriff wants you at the livery. We found tracks." The footsteps outside her door hesitated, then retreated. The intruder moved away, back through the store, and out the front door. Clara lay in the dark, clutching the gun, tears of terror finally leaking from her eyes. The paper burned against her ankle like a brand. She was no longer just a witness. She was an accomplice to the truth, and in the Texas Panhandle, the truth was the most dangerous thing a woman could carry. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness, she saw the face of the young warrior again. Not a savage, a man. "They want to blame us." "I will not let them," she whispered to the empty room. "I will not let them." The sun rose over the Panhandle like a judgment, bleeding crimson across a sky that offered no clouds for shelter. Clara, May Harper, had been riding since the first gray light of dawn touched the sagebrush, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She had slipped out of the trading post while the town slept the fitful sleep of the guilty, stealing a roan gelding from the livery stable. It was a theft that would hang her if she were caught, but staying meant a bullet in the back, and Clara had decided she preferred the rope to the ambush. She pushed the horse hard, too hard for the heat that was already rising in shimmering waves off the hard pan. Her destination was nowhere. Her destination was simply away. Away from Silas Crow, away from the lies being tapped out on the telegraph wire, and away from the memory of the man with the Consolidated Rail Company medallion dying with an arrow in his throat. By mid-morning, the heat was a physical weight. The water in her canteen was warm and tasted of tin. The roan stumbled, its breathing labored, and Clara knew with a sinking dread that she had pushed the animal past its limit. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her throat dry as parchment. She pulled the reins, slowing the horse to a walk, but the damage was done. The animal favored its left foreleg, limping badly. Clara dismounted, her boots hitting the dust with a puff of red grit. She led the horse, walking into the vast, blinding emptiness of the plains. Behind her, miles back but closing the distance, she saw it, a plume of dust. Crow had not waited long to organize his rescue party. They were coming for her, riding fresh mounts, driven by the promise of silver and the fear of what she knew. They would call it a rescue mission to the townspeople, claiming the poor widow had wandered off in shock. But Clara knew that if they found her out here, alone, she would never return to tell the tale. She walked until her legs felt like lead. The sun beat down on her neck, relentless and cruel. The horizon began to swim. The scrub brush looked like crouching men. The heat played tricks on her mind, conjuring lakes of blue water that vanished when she blinked. She stumbled, falling to her knees. The roan nudged her shoulder, but she lacked the strength to stand. "Get up, Clara," she told herself, her voice a croak. "You did not survive a winter of starvation to die of thirst in the summer." She forced herself up, cresting a small ridge, and stopped dead. He was there. Tahuya sat atop his paint horse 20 yards away, as if he had grown out of the earth itself. He was not looking at her. He was looking past her, at the dust cloud on the horizon. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the heat haze. Clara's hand went to the revolver tucked in her belt, but the motion was weak. Red Hawk turned his gaze to her. Under the harsh sunlight, he looked less like a spirit and more like a man carved from mahogany and granite. He saw her hand on the gun, but he did not reach for his weapons. He merely shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He urged his horse forward, closing the distance slowly. Clara stood her ground, though her knees threatened to buckle. "They are coming," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel rolling in a stream bed. "I know," Clara rasped. "They are not riding to save you," he stated. It was not a question. "No," Clara said. "They are riding to silence me." Red Hawk looked at the lame roan, then back at Clara. He extended a hand. It was a calloused hand, stained with the red dust of the plains. "Come, my horse is strong." Clara hesitated. The stories of her childhood, the whispers in the trading post, all screamed that to go with a Comanche was a fate worse than death. They said she would be a slave, a trophy, a victim. But she looked into his eyes and saw none of that. She saw a pragmatism that matched her own. He did not look at her with the possessive greed of Silas Crow. He looked at her as one might look at a wounded deer that needed to be moved before the wolves arrived, a life that deserved a chance to continue. She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him with effortless strength. The paint horse shifted but accepted the double burden. Red Hawk leaned forward, whispering something in his own tongue to the animal. They took off, not running, but moving with a swift, ground-eating lope that seemed to dodge the worst of the terrain. They did not ride into the open. Red Hawk guided the horse into a maze of dry washes and rock formations, a labyrinth of stone that swallowed their tracks. An hour later, he pulled the horse to a halt deep within a narrow crevice of rock. He signaled for her to be silent and slid off the horse, motioning for her to stay low. They crouched together in the shadow of a sandstone overhang. Clara could smell the scent of him: sage, wood smoke, and horse sweat. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the scent of the land. Above them, on the rim of the canyon, hooves clattered against stone. Voices drifted down, distorted by the wind but audible. "She cannot have gone far," a man's voice growled. It was the foreman of the railway crew. "Not on a lame horse. Maybe the Comanches got her," another voice suggested. "If they did, it saves us a bullet," the foreman replied. "Crow said $500 if we bring her back dead. He said to blame it on the heat or the Indians. Just make sure she does not talk to the judge in Amarillo." Clara pressed her back against the rock, her breath catching in her throat. $500. That was the price of her life. "And what about the village?" the second man asked. "Crow is arranging it. We burn it for the railway right of way. Once the army clears the canyon, the land is ours. Now keep looking. I want that money." The hoofbeats faded. Clara let out a shuddering breath. The reality of her situation settled into her bones. There was no going back. The society she belonged to, the laws she respected, the town she lived in, they had all turned against her for the sake of a railway line. Red Hawk looked at her. He had understood enough. "They burned the land," he said quietly. "They burned the people." "They want the canyon," Clara said, meeting his gaze. "They want everything." "Then we must stop them," he said. They rode until the sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange. The terrain changed, shifting from dry scrub to a hidden valley where a creek still held water. This was the Quahati winter camp, moved now for the summer hunt. Clara had expected a war camp, a place of spikes and skulls. What she saw was a community. Teepees made of buffalo hide stood in a wide circle. Smoke curled lazily from cooking fires. Children with hair like black silk ran between the lodges, chasing dogs. Women sat in groups, scraping hides or pounding meat, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Old men sat by the fires, smoking pipes. It was a scene of domesticity so normal, so human, that it shattered the caricature Clara had held in her mind for years. But the arrival of Red Hawk with a white woman on his horse shattered the peace. Heads turned. Silence rippled through the camp like a wave. The children stopped running. The women stood up, their faces hardening into masks of suspicion and hostility. Red Hawk helped Clara down. Her legs were stiff, and she stumbled. He caught her elbow to steady her. A tall warrior with a scar running down his cheek strode forward. He spoke sharply to Red Hawk in Comanche, gesturing angrily at Clara. His tone was aggressive, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Red Hawk answered calmly but firmly. He pointed to the north, back toward the town, and then to Clara. He mimed the act of writing, then placed his hand over his heart. "What is he saying?" Clara whispered, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on her. "He says you are dangerous," Red Hawk said without looking at her. "He says we should give you to the soldiers to make them go away. He thinks you are a spy." "I am not a spy," Clara said, though her voice was weak. "I know," Red Hawk said. He turned back to the scarred warrior, whose name, Clara would later learn, was Stonehand, and spoke one final, decisive sentence. Stonehand spat on the ground and stormed away, but he did not draw his knife. Red Hawk guided Clara toward a lodge set slightly apart from the others. "My aunt," he explained. "She is a healer, Naru." Naru was a small woman, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes bright and sharp as a bird's. She looked at Clara not with hatred, but with a clinical curiosity. She saw the sunburn on Clara's nose, the exhaustion in her posture, and the bruises on her arm where Crow's man had grabbed her the night before. She clicked her tongue and ushered Clara inside. The interior of the lodge was dim and cool, smelling of sweetgrass and earth. Naru pushed Clara gently down onto a pile of furs. She brought a bowl of cool water and a cloth. She did not ask for permission. She simply began to work, wiping the dust from Clara's face, her touch firm but surprisingly gentle. She applied a salve that smelled of bear grease and mint to the bruises. Clara flinched at first, but the coolness of the salve brought instant relief. For the first time in days, Clara felt tears prick her eyes. It was not the danger that broke her. It was the kindness. A kindness offered by a stranger, an enemy, in a language of touch that needed no translation. Red Hawk stood by the entrance of the lodge, arms crossed, watching. He was guarding her. Clara realized, not keeping her prisoner, but keeping the rest of the camp out. Clara sat up, wincing as her muscles protested. She remembered the secret she carried, the reason she was being hunted. "Red Hawk," she said. He turned to her. "I have something," she said. "The reason they want me dead. It is not just what I saw. It is what I have." She reached for the hem of her calico skirt. Her fingers, usually so nimble with a needle, felt clumsy. She found the spot where she'd hastily stitched the pocket the night before. She didn't have her scissors, so she used her teeth to tear the thread, spitting out the cotton. She pulled out the folded, soot-stained scrap of telegraph paper. Red Hawk stepped closer, crouching beside the fire pit. Clara handed him the paper. "It is from the man who attacked the wagon," she explained. "It is a message, a plan." Red Hawk looked at the strange markings. He could not read the words, but he knew the shapes of the white man's writing were dangerous. "Read it," he commanded softly. Clara took the paper back. The firelight flickered over the pencil marks. "It says PDC," she said, tracing the letters. "That stands for Palo Duro Canyon. That is where your people are gathering." "Yes." Red Hawk's eyes narrowed. "The canyon is our sanctuary. The walls are high. The water is good." "It is a trap," Clara said, her voice trembling. "The next part says load at noon, burn, and the date. It is 3 days from now. They are not just sending soldiers to fight you. They are bringing a shipment, explosives, or perhaps they mean to burn the canyon itself to flush you out." Red Hawk took the paper back, staring at it as if the paper itself were hot. "Crow, he said the name like a curse. "He calls for a meeting. He sent a messenger with a white flag. He says he wants to talk about peace. He says he wants to trade beef for land." "He does not want peace," Clara said urgently. "He wants you all in one place. He wants to wipe you out so the railroad can go through without obstacles. That is what the telegraph said. Terminate obstacles." Red Hawk looked at her, and in that moment, the distance between them vanished. They were no longer Comanche settlers. They were two soldiers in the same trench. "We must warn the chiefs," he said. "But words from a white woman may not be enough. Stonehand will say you lied to lead us into a trap. Then I will show them, Clara said. I know the ledger books. I know where the cargo is coming from. If we can find the wagons before they reach the canyon. She stopped. The magnitude of what she was suggesting hit her. She was plotting against her own people, against the army of her country. But then she remembered the man with the hobnailed boots and the brass medallion. They were not her people. Her people were the ones who wanted to live in peace. And right now, the only peace she found was in this lodge. Night settled over the camp. Naru brought them dried meat and a bladder of water. They ate in silence, sitting on the buffalo robes. Clara watched Redhawk as he sharpened his knife by the firelight. The flickering glow cast shadows across his face, softening the hard angles. He looked up and caught her staring. You should sleep, he said. Tomorrow we ride hard. Why did you come back for me? Clara asked. The question had been burning in her since the dry wash. Redhawk paused. He tested the edge of the blade against his thumb. I saw you in the town. You were the only one who did not look at the horizon with greed. You looked at it with sadness. Sadness. You look for something you lost, he said, like the wolf who lost the pack. Clara looked down at her hands. I lost my husband 3 years ago. I lost my hope a long time before that. Hope is like water, Redhawk said, sheathing the knife. It hides in the ground. You have to dig for it. He passed her the water skin. His fingers brushed hers. It was a brief contact, but it sent a jolt through Clara that had nothing to do with fear. It was a recognition of shared survival. They were both alone, both hunted, both standing on the edge of a world that wanted to consume them. Thank you, she whispered. Sleep, he repeated. I will watch. Clara lay back on the furs. For the first time in years, she felt safe, not because there were walls or locks, but because there was him. The next morning broke with a tension that vibrated through the ground. A scout rode into camp just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. His horse was foaming, its sides heaving. He shouted news that sent a ripple of alarm through the warriors. Redhawk listened, his face darkening. He walked over to where Clara was helping Naru fold the sleeping robes. What is it? Clara asked, sensing the shift in the air. The scout says the bluecoats are moving, Redhawk said grimly. And wagons, big wagons covered in canvas. They are moving fast toward the canyon. They are early. The date on the paper, Clara said. They moved it up. Redhawk said, or the paper was old. It does not matter. The massacre is not 3 days away. It is scheduled for tomorrow. He looked at Clara, his eyes fierce. We have to go. If we do not stop those wagons, there will be no tomorrow for any of us. Clara stood up, dusting off her skirt. The fear was still there, but it was pushed down by a cold, hard resolve. She was Clara May Harper, and she was done sewing shirts while men destroyed the world. Get the horses, she said. I am ready. We cannot fight a war with a scrap of burnt paper, Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She stood near the horses, watching Redhawk tighten the cinch on his paint. That note proves they are planning something, but it does not prove who gave the order. If we go to the army with just this, they will laugh at us. Or worse, they will arrest us for stealing mail. Redhawk paused, the leather strap in his hand. He looked at her over the saddle. To go back there is to walk into the throat of the wolf. Crow has eyes everywhere. The blue coats are watching the roads. Crow uses the telegraph like a weapon, Clara insisted. He sends lies faster than a horse can run, but the telegraph office keeps a log. Every message sent, every message received. It is written down in a book. If I can get that book, or a copy of the full transmission, we have his signature on the order to massacre your people. And if you are caught, Redhawk asked, then I am dead anyway. Clara replied, Silas Crow does not leave loose ends. I would rather die trying to stop him than die running away. Redhawk studied her face. He saw the fear there, plain and naked, but beneath it was a spine of steel that the last 2 days had forged. He nodded once. Then we go, but we move like smoke. If we are seen, We do not fight to win. We fight to run. They rode out as the sun began its descent, sticking to the deep ravines and the shadows of the mesas. By the time the lights of the settlement flickered into view, the moon was rising, a sliver of bone in a black sky. They left the horses a mile out, hidden in a thicket of mesquite near the dry creek bed. The walk into town was a lesson in terror. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a boot on gravel. Clara wore a heavy woolen poncho Red Hawk had traded for in the camp, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to obscure her face. Red Hawk had forgotten his bone breastplate, wearing a simple cotton shirt and trousers taken from a clothesline miles back, but his hair and his movement were undeniably Comanche. He moved with a silence that unnerved Clara. On the soft earth, he made no sound at all. When they reached the edge of the town, the challenge changed. The earth gave way to boardwalks made of warped, sun-baked timber. "Walk on the edges," Red Hawk whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Where the wood is nailed down, it groans less." Clara watched him. For a man born to the open plains, he adapted to the architecture of the white man with the instinct of a predator entering a new hunting ground. He moved low, his weight shifting fluidly, testing each plank before committing to it. The town was mostly asleep, but the saloon was still alive with the tinny sound of a piano and the roar of drunk buffalo hunters. The noise was a blessing. It covered the soft thud of their boots as they circled behind the livery stable and approached the rear of the trading post. The telegraph office was a small lean-to built onto the side of the main store. A single oil lamp burned in the window. "Stay here," Clara whispered, pointing to the shadow of a water barrel. "If I am not out in 10 minutes, I will come in," Red Hawk said. His hand rested on the knife at his belt. "And I will not be quiet." Clara slipped to the back door. It was locked, but she knew the trick. You had to lift the handle up before turning. She held her breath, lifted, and turned. The latch clicked softly. She slipped inside. The smell of stale tobacco and ozone hit her. Elijah Pike was asleep at his desk, his head resting on his arms. He was 16 years old, a gangly boy from Ohio with ink-stained fingers and a perpetual look of bewilderment. He twitched as the door closed, lifting his head. "Mr. Whitaker," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Clara stepped into the circle of lamplight, removing her hat. "Hello, Elijah." The boy jumped so hard his chair nearly tipped over. "Mrs. Harper Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Everyone says you are dead. They said the Comanches took you." "Keep your voice down," Clara hissed, stepping closer. "Please, Elijah." "Mr. Crow has men out looking for you," Elijah stammered, his eyes wide. He looked at the door, then back at her. "He says you were kidnapped. I have to tell someone." He reached for the telegraph key, his hand trembling. Clara placed her hand over his. Her grip was firm. "Elijah, look at me. Am I tied up? Am I bleeding?" The boy froze, looking at her hand on his, then up at her face. "No, ma'am." "Silas Crow did not send men to save me," Clara said, her voice low and urgent. "He sent them to kill me because I saw who really attacked the mail wagon. It was not Comanches. Elijah, it was Crow's men. I saw the boots. I saw the badges." Elijah went pale. That cannot be. Mr. Crow is a businessman." "He is a murderer," Clara said. "And he is using this machine to start a war. He is sending lies on the wire to bring the army down on innocent people so he can steal the land for the railroad." She leaned in, her eyes locking onto his. "If you touch that key, if you call for help, 100 men, women, and children are going to die tomorrow at Palo Duro, and their blood will be on your hands." "Elijah, can you live with that?" The boy swallowed hard. Adam's apple bobbed. He looked at the telegraph key, then at the ledger book open on the desk. He was a good boy. Clara knew. He wrote letters to his mother every Sunday. He was terrified, but he was not corrupted. Not yet. He made me send a message yesterday," Elijah whispered. "It was in code. I did not know what it meant, but he made me burn the original. I have the burnt piece, Clara said. But I need the full log. I need to know exactly what he told the army. Elijah hesitated for a heartbreaking second. Then, with shaking fingers, he opened the ledger to the previous day's entry. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil. I cannot give you the book, he said, his voice cracking. Whitaker would know, but I can copy it. I remember the cipher key he uses. He thinks I'm stupid, but I watch. He wrote furiously for a minute. The scratch of the pencil was the loudest sound in the room. He tore the page out and handed it to Clara. Go, he said. Please, Mrs. Harper, just go. Clara took the paper. She wanted to hug him, but there was no time. Thank you, Elijah. You are a brave man. She turned and slipped out the back door. Red Hawk was waiting in the shadows. He saw the paper in her hand and nodded. We have it? Clara breathed. It says everything. Plant the lances. Burn the wagons. No survivors. It is the order for the setup. Then we ride, Red Hawk said. But as they turned to leave, disaster struck. A door slammed nearby. A man stepped out of the back of the saloon, unbuttoning his trousers to relieve himself against the alley wall. It was one of the men from the canyon, the one who had run away. He looked up and saw them. For a second, nobody moved. The man blinked, seeing a woman in a poncho and a savage in the alleyway. Hey, the man shouted, fumbling for his gun belt. It is them, the girl and the Indian. They are here. Run, Red Hawk roared. He grabbed Clara's hand, and they bolted. A gunshot cracked the air, chipping the brick of the building next to Clara's head. Then another. The shout acted like a kick to a hornet's nest. Men poured out of the saloon, confused, drunk, and armed. Get to the horses, Clara yelled. They sprinted down the alleyway, boots pounding on the dirt. Bullets whizzed past them like angry bees. They scrambled over a fence and dropped into the corral of the livery stable. The horses inside panicked, whinnying and kicking. Through the barn, Red Hawk commanded. They burst into the livery barn. It was dark, smelling of hay and manure. Cut them off on the street, a voice screamed outside. It was Crow. Clara recognized the smooth, commanding baritone. Red Hawk shoved Clara toward a ladder leading to the hayloft. Up the roof is the only way, Clara climbed, her skirts tangling in her legs. She hauled herself into the loft just as the barn doors were kicked open below. Lantern light flooded the space. They are in the loft, someone yelled. Bullets ripped through the floorboards of the loft, sending splinters flying. Red Hawk vaulted up beside her. He didn't pause. He grabbed a heavy kerosene lantern hanging from a post and hurled it down at the men below. It smashed, and flames whooshed up, creating a wall of fire and chaos. Come! Red Hawk pulled her toward the hayloft door that opened to the outside, 10 feet above the ground. Below them was a water trough and the alley. Jump, he said. They leaped together, landing hard in the mud beside the trough. Clara's ankle twisted, sending a sharp bolt of pain up her leg, but Red Hawk was already pulling her up. They ran through the maze of shacks, weaving between clotheslines and piles of lumber. The town was fully awake now, a beast of torches and shouting men. They reached the edge of the settlement, the open desert stretching out before them. The horses are too far, Clara gasped, limping. We will never make it before they ride us down. The rocks. Red Hawk pointed to a cluster of boulders a quarter-mile to the west. Go! They ran. Behind them, mounted men were already spilling out of the main street, their torches bobbing like fireflies. Clara's lungs burned. Her twisted ankle screamed with every step. She stumbled on a patch of loose shale, falling hard onto her hands and knees. I cannot, she wheezed. Red Hawk stopped. He did not look at the pursuing riders. He looked only at her. He reached down, gripping her arm. You can, he said fiercely. You are strong. Clara. He pulled her up. For a moment, he did not let go. His hand slid down her arm and gripped her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. It was a grip of iron, but it was also an anchor. In the midst of the gunfire and the chaos, that contact was the only real thing in the world. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise that he would not leave her. They scrambled into the rocks just as the wind began to howl. It started as a low moan, then rose to a shriek. The horizon to the north had disappeared. A wall of darkness was rushing toward them, blotting out the stars. "Sandstorm!" Red Hawk shouted over the rising gale. "Cover your face!" The storm hit them with the force of a physical blow. The air turned solid with grit. It was a haboob, a monster of the plains that turned day into night and night into a suffocating void. Visibility dropped to 0. The torches of the pursuers vanished instantly. The sound of hoofbeats was swallowed by the roar of the wind. Red Hawk dragged Clara into a deep fissure between two massive slabs of sandstone. It was a tight space, barely wide enough for 2 people. They collapsed against the stone, gasping for air. The dust was everywhere in their eyes, their mouths, their noses. Clara coughed, choking. She felt like she was drowning in earth. Red Hawk pulled the bandana from his neck. He poured the last precious drops of water from his canteen onto the cloth and pressed it over Clara's nose and mouth. "Breathe slow," he instructed, shouting to be heard over the wind. "Through the cloth!" Clara pressed the damp fabric to her face, inhaling the moisture. It smelled of him, but it was life. She huddled against him, shivering as the temperature plummeted. The storm raged outside their small sanctuary, a fury of sand that scoured the rock. Red Hawk wrapped his arms around her, shielding her body with his own, his back to the opening of the crevice. They stayed like that for what felt like hours. The world outside was gone. There was only the wind, the dust, and the heat of his body against hers. Clara remembered Naru's words from the camp. "When the wind changes, the truth changes." "The tracks," Clara whispered into the cloth. "Our tracks." Red Hawk nodded, his chin resting on the top of her head. "The wind is a spirit. It wipes the slate clean. They will not find our trail. By morning, the land will be new." It was a strange, almost supernatural intervention. Just when capture seemed certain, the land itself had risen up to hide them. It was as if the Panhandle, usually so cruel, had decided to grant them mercy. Slowly, the roar of the wind began to subside. The air remained thick with dust, but the violence had passed. Clara pulled the cloth from her face. "We have the proof," she said, tapping the pocket where she had shoved Elijah's paper. "We have the log." "Yes," Red Hawk said. He looked out at the swirling gray darkness. "But now Crow knows." He turned back to her, his face streaked with dust, his eyes intense. "He knows you are alive," Red Hawk said, "and he knows you are with me. He will not stop now. He cannot stop. If he does not kill us, he hangs." Clara looked down at her hand, the one he had held so tightly during the run. She could still feel the pressure of his fingers. "Then we make sure he is the one who hangs," Clara said. The storm had bought them time, but it had also clarified the battlefield. There was no going back to the trading post. There was no going back to the life of a seamstress. She was an outlaw now, holding the rope that could hang the most powerful man in the territory. "We need to get to the fort," Clara said. "To the colonel. He is a hard man, but he is in the regular army. He hates the contractors." "The fort is 2 days' ride," Red Hawk said. "And Crow will have men on every trail." "Then we do not take the trails," Clara said, her voice hardening. "We go through the Badlands. We go the way the wind goes." Red Hawk looked at her with a new respect. The frightened widow who had sewn shirts in the dim light was gone. In her place was a woman who had looked into the eye of the storm and not blinked. "Rest now," he said gently. "When the dust settles, the hunt begins again." Clara leaned her head back against the rock, closing her eyes. She was exhausted, bruised, and hunted. But as she listened to the fading wind and the steady breathing of the warrior beside her, she realized she was not afraid, not anymore. She had the truth in her pocket, and she had a partner who would walk through fire for her. "Let them come," she whispered to the dark. "Let them come." The sun hung directly overhead, a white-hot coin nailed to the center of a bleached sky. Palo Duro Canyon opened up beneath them like a wound in the earth, its walls layered with red clay and white gypsum, beautiful and treacherous. Clara May Harper lay flat on a ridge of sandstone, looking down into the basin. Beside her, Tuhuya Red Hawk watched with eyes that mirrored the hardness of the land. Below, the stage was set for a tragedy written by Silas Crow. 3 heavy canvas-covered wagons sat in the center of the clearing. Around them, a group of townspeople and a detachment of cavalry soldiers stood in a loose formation, their rifles resting uneasily in their hands. They looked nervous, sweating in their wool uniforms and heavy coats. Silas Crow sat on his tall black horse, looking every inch the diplomat. Flanked by his trusted lieutenant, a man with a scarf pulled up over his nose and a hat pulled low. Opposite them, emerging from the shadows of the canyon walls, rode the Comanches. Stonehand led them, his face painted for war, followed by 20 warriors. They did not trust this meeting, but the promise of food and a treaty to secure their winter grounds had drawn them out. "It is a slaughter pen," Red Hawk whispered. "Crow has placed the soldiers on the high ground behind the wagons. Crossfire." Clara gripped the stock of her rifle, her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic rhythm of fear. She could turn around. She could crawl back down the reverse slope, mount the paint horse, and ride until Texas was just a memory. No one would blame her. She was a widow, a seamstress, and nobody. But then she looked at the young boy standing near Crow's horse. It was Elijah Pike. Crow had dragged the terrified telegraph operator along, likely to serve as the official witness to whatever lie Crow intended to manufacture. Elijah looked sick, his face pale as milk. "I cannot leave him," Clara said. "And I cannot let them die?" "If you go down there," Red Hawk said, his voice tight, "you step between the hammer and the anvil." "I know," Clara said. She looked at Red Hawk. "But I have the truth, and you have the courage. Is that not enough?" Red Hawk looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "It will have to be." He stood up, full height on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky. He let out a piercing cry, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. Below, every head turned up. "Hold fire!" Red Hawk shouted in English, his voice carrying over the wind. "It is a trap." Stonehand looked up, confusion warring with anger on his face. Crow's head snapped up, his composure cracking for the first time. "Get them!" Crow roared, pointing at the ridge. "Hostiles on the flank!" "No!" Clara screamed. She scrambled down the scree slope, sliding and stumbling, rocks tearing at her skirt. She waved the stolen telegraph log in the air. "Do not shoot. We have proof." The tension in the basin, already stretched to the breaking point, snapped. It was not a soldier who fired. It was Crow's lieutenant, the man with the scarf. He raised a pistol and fired a shot into the air, then leveled it at Stonehand. "They are attacking!" the lieutenant yelled. That single shot was the spark in the powder keg. Chaos erupted. The soldiers, jumpy and terrified, opened fire. The Comanche warriors, reacting to the betrayal they had expected all along, loosed their arrows and charged. The air instantly filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the screams of horses, and the choking red dust that rose like smoke. "Stop!" Clara shrieked, reaching the floor of the basin. She ran toward the center, ignoring the bullets that whined past her like angry hornets. "Stop it! It is a lie!" Red Hawk was ahead of her. He did not run to kill. He sprinted toward Stonehand, tackling the older warrior just as a volley of rifle fire chewed up the ground where he had been standing. "It is Crow!" Red Hawk shouted in Comanche, grappling with his own kinsman. "Crow is the enemy, not the soldiers. Retreat to the rocks." Crow saw Clara running through the melee, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He drew his own pearl-handled revolver. "Kill her!" Crow screamed to his men. $5,000 to the man who drops the girl." He aimed his weapon at Clara. She was exposed, 50 yards away, freezing for a split second as she looked down the barrel of his gun. She saw the flash of the muzzle, but she did not feel the bullet. A blur of motion slammed into her. Red Hawk had abandoned his argument with Stonehand and thrown himself into the line of fire. The impact knocked the wind out of Clara. They hit the hard earth together, rolling in the dust. Red Hawk grunted. A sharp, guttural sound of pain. "Tuhuya!" Clara cried, scrambling to her knees. Blood was blossoming on his left shoulder, dark and fast against his skin. He grit his teeth, his eyes wide with shock but clear. "Go!" he gasped, trying to push her toward the cover of a wagon wheel. "Run!" "No," Clara said, her fear evaporating into a cold, white-hot fury. She pressed her hand against his wound, stemming the flow. "I am done running." She grabbed the telegraph log she had dropped and stood up. The dust swirled around her, a vortex of violence, but she felt strangely anchored. She saw Elijah Pike cowering under one of the wagons. "Elijah!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the din. "Read it, tell them." She threw the paper toward the boy. It fluttered in the wind, landing near his boot. Crow was advancing on his horse, cocking his pistol for a second shot. "She is lying! She is mad! Kill her!" But his lieutenant, the man with the scarf, rode between them. He raised his gun, aiming not at Clara, but at Red Hawk, who was trying to rise. "I will finish it, boss!" the lieutenant shouted. The wind whipped the scarf from the lieutenant's face. Clara stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The noise of the battle faded into a dull roar. She knew that face. It was older, harder, lined by sun and sin. But she knew it. She knew the shape of the jaw. She knew the way his left eye twitched when he was about to do something violent. "Frank," she whispered. It was Frank Harper, her husband, the man she had buried in an empty coffin for 3 years ago, the man she had mourned, the man she had starved to pay off the debts of... He was not dead. He was Silas Crow's hired gun. Frank looked down at her. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a wash of shame that was quickly drowned by a sneer of survival. "Hello, Clara," Frank said. "You always were too stubborn for your own good. You should have stayed in the store." The betrayal hit Clara harder than any bullet. It was a physical blow to her gut. He had left her. He had let her believe he was dead so he could run from his gambling debts and start a new life as a thug for a railroad tycoon. "You," Clara choked out. "You coward!" Frank raised the gun higher. "Nothing personal. Clara, it is just business," Red Hawk roared, surging up from the ground with a strength born of desperation. He did not have a weapon in his hand, so he scooped up a handful of the red dirt and threw it into the eyes of Frank's horse. The horse reared, screaming. Frank lost his aim, his shot going wild into the sky. He fought to stay in the saddle. Clara did not waste the moment. She did not reach for her husband. She reached for the truth. "Lieutenant!" she screamed at the army officer commanding the soldiers. "Look at the wagons! Look at the crates!" She ran to the nearest canvas-covered wagon and yanked the tie-downs loose. The canvas flapped open. Inside, there were no blankets. There was no beef. There were crates marked with the stamp of a mining company. "Dynamite!" Clara shouted. "And rifles! These are not trade goods. Crow brought them to plant on the bodies. He is arming a fake rebellion." The army lieutenant, a man named Patterson, lowered his rifle. He looked at the crates. He looked at the chaos. "Elijah!" Clara yelled again. "Read the log." Elijah Pike crawled out from under the wagon, holding the paper Clara had given him. He stood up, trembling. A boy surrounded by men, but he found his voice. It says, 'No survivors,'" Elijah shouted, his voice cracking. "It is signed by Crow. It says, 'Burn the canyon. Blame the savages. Secure the rail line.'" The soldiers stopped firing. The doubt that had been festering in them found a foothold. They looked at Crow. They looked at the crates of dynamite. "It is a forgery," Crow screamed, his face purple with rage. "She is sleeping with the Indian. She is a traitor." But the momentum had shifted. The truth, once spoken, was harder to kill than a person. Frank Harper regained control of his horse. He looked at the soldiers lowering their weapons. He looked at Crow, who was now exposed as a monster. And he looked at Clara, who stood tall amidst the dust, staring at him with eyes that held no love, only judgment. Frank made his choice. He spurred his horse, not toward Clara, but toward the gap in the canyon wall. "You are on your own, Silas," Frank shouted, abandoning his boss just as he had abandoned his wife. Crow turned, realizing he was alone. The soldiers were turning toward him. Stonehand and his warriors were regrouping, sensing the shift. Crow snarled, a cornered animal. He raised his gun toward Clara one last time. "If I go to hell, you are coming with me." Red Hawk was there. He slammed his shoulder into Clara, knocking her down behind the wheel of the wagon just as Crow fired. The bullet splintered the wood inches from her head. "Fire!" Lieutenant Patterson ordered. A dozen army rifles cracked. Crow's horse was hit. It went down, throwing Crow into the dust. He scrambled up, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his expensive coat. He looked at the soldiers, then at the vengeful Comanches advancing from the rocks. He turned and ran. He scrambled up the rocky slope on foot, disappearing into the labyrinth of the canyon walls, leaving a trail of blood behind him. "Let him go!" Red Hawk shouted to Stonehand, who was preparing to give chase. "The women, the children, we must get them out." The battle was not over, but the massacre had been averted. The soldiers were confused, holding their fire, but the confusion would not last. Red Hawk grabbed Clara's arm. His face was gray with pain, but his grip was iron. "We have to go. Patterson will arrest us all until he sorts this out, and Crow is still out there." Clara looked at the spot where Frank had disappeared. The ghost was gone. The man was gone. All that was left was the anger, cold and sharp as a knife. "I am ready," she said. She helped Red Hawk onto a stray army horse. She mounted behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, feeling the sticky warmth of his blood on her hands. They rode not away from the danger, but toward the Comanche lines. Red Hawk guided the retreat, leading the women and children who had been hiding in the caves up a hidden goat path that the soldiers could not follow. As they crested the rim of the canyon, Clara looked back. The dust was settling. The soldiers were surrounding the wagons of dynamite. Elijah Pike was standing in the middle of the clearing, weeping, and somewhere in the rocks, Silas Crow was bleeding and hating, a wounded snake waiting to strike. "He will come for you," Red Hawk said, his voice weak. "Let him," Clara said, pressing her face against Red Hawk's back. "I am not the woman he thought I was." They rode into the vast, open silence of the plains, leaving the wreckage of their old lives behind in the burning dust of Palo Duro. The sun was setting now, turning the red earth the color of dried blood. They were alive. They were together, and for the first time, they were free of the lies that had bound them. But the shadow of the canyon stretched long, and Clara knew that the final reckoning was yet to come. Frank was out there. Crow was out there, and the night was coming fast. The silence that followed the battle at Palo Duro Canyon was heavier than the gunfire had been. It was a silence made of dust settling on the dead, of wind hissing through the sagebrush, and of the exhausted breathing of the living. There was no cheering. There was no grand victory march. There was only the grim reality of survival. Clara May Harper rode the stray army horse, her arms wrapped tight around Red Hawk's waist. His blood had dried, turning the fabric of her shirt stiff and dark, a physical reminder of the price he had paid for her life. They moved slowly through the labyrinth of the Badlands, putting miles between themselves and the carnage. But the images of the afternoon played over and over in Clara's mind, like a nightmare she could not wake from. She saw the soldiers confused and shouting. She saw the fear in Elijah's eyes. She saw the bodies of the Comanche warriors who had fallen in the first volley, men who had just wanted to secure food for their families for the winter. Guilt sat in her stomach like a stone. She had wanted to save them. She had wanted to stop the war. Instead, she felt as though she had merely dragged two colliding worlds into a single, bloody intersection. She had exposed the truth. Yes, but the truth was covered in ash. "Stop!" Red Hawk rasped. They were in a dry creek bed, miles south of the canyon. The walls of the arroyo rose high on either side, offering shelter from the wind and prying eyes. Clara slid off the horse, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She helped Red Hawk down. He moved stiffly, his face gray in the failing light. The bullet had passed through the muscle of his shoulder, a clean wound, but he had lost a lot of blood. "We rest here," he said, leaning against the sandstone bank. "The horses need water." There was a small trickle of muddy water in the center of the creek bed. Clara led the horses to it, then returned to Red Hawk. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the shooting stopped. "I am sorry," she whispered. Red Hawk looked up, his eyes dark and feverish. "For what? For saving the tribe, for saving the boy. For bringing this to you," Clara said, her voice cracking. "If I had just stayed in the trading post, if I had turned away, maybe those men would still be alive. I feel like a curse. Tuhuya, everywhere I go, fire follows." Red Hawk reached out with his good hand, gripping her wrist. The fire was already burning. "Clara, you just showed us where it was. Do not take the blame of evil men onto your own soul." He paused, looking at the darkening sky. "But I have fear too." "You?" Clara asked. "I did not think you feared anything." "I fear what comes next," he said quietly. "I fear that by loving you, I tie a rope around your neck. They will never forgive you for standing with us. You are marked now, a traitor to your own skin." "My skin never did me any favors," Clara said bitterly. "And my own people were the ones who tried to kill me." She began to gather dry wood for a small fire. They needed heat. The desert night was dropping fast, and the chill would be dangerous for his wound. She was kneeling in the sand, striking a match, when the sound of a pebble skittering down the canyon wall made her freeze. It was not a natural sound. It was the sound of a boot slipping. Clara spun around, her hand diving for the revolver she had taken from the saddlebag. "Silas," a voice hissed from the darkness. "Do not shoot. It is just the girl." Two figures emerged from the shadows of the creek bend. They were ragged, limping, and desperate. Silas Crow looked nothing like the railroad tycoon in the velvet coat. His face was scratched, his coat was torn, and his arm was bound in a bloody handkerchief. Beside him, looking equally haggard, was Frank Harper. They had tracked the horse. Desperation had made them bold, or perhaps just stupid. Well, Crow sneered, stepping into the faint moonlight. He held his pistol in his left hand, his right arm useless. "I told you, Clara, you do not walk away from me." Red Hawk tried to rise, snarling, but his legs buckled. He was too weak to fight. "Stay down," Clara commanded him. She stood up, leveling the heavy Colt revolver at the two men. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were dry. "Put the gun down. Clara," Frank said, stepping forward. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, but his eyes darted to the rifle scabbard on the horse. "Be reasonable. Crow is finished. The army knows. But we can make a deal. We can just walk away." "A deal," Clara laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Like the deal you made with the railroad? Like the deal you made to leave me a widow for 3 years while you played bandit?" "I had debts. Clara," Frank pleaded, his voice rising to a whine. "Gambling debts. Bad men. I had to disappear. I did it to protect you." "You did it to save your own skin," Clara said. Crow lost his patience. "Enough talk." He raised his gun. Clara did not hesitate. She did not think about morality or the Bible or the lessons of proper ladies. She thought about the man bleeding on the ground behind her. She thought about the lies that had poisoned the territory. She pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand. Crow screamed, dropping his pistol as a bullet tore through his thigh. He collapsed into the dirt, writhing in agony. Frank froze, staring at Crow, then back at Clara. He saw the barrel of the gun shift toward him. "Clara," Frank whispered, "I am your husband." "No," Clara said. Her voice was steady now, cold as the night air. "My husband died 3 years ago. You are just a ghost who forgot to stay buried. I can change," Frank begged, taking a step back. "We can go to California, start over. I have money stashed away. Please, Clara, it was the circumstances. The world forced me to do it." Clara looked at him, and she realized with a jolt that she felt nothing. No hate, no love, just a profound, exhausting pity. "The world does not force you to shoot children. Frank," she said, "the world does not force you to burn villages. You chose greed. You chose betrayal." She cocked the hammer of the gun. "Go, run, before the soldiers find you, because I will not kill you. Frank, you are not worth the bullet." Frank stared at her, seeing the absolute finality in her eyes. He looked at the moaning crow, then at the darkness of the desert. He spat on the ground, turned, and scrambled up the bank, running into the night like the coyote he was. Clara lowered the gun. She walked over to Crow, kicked his pistol away into the darkness, and looked down at him. "The army is 2 hours behind us," she said to the groaning man. "They will find you. And this time, you cannot buy your way out." She turned her back on him and went to Red Hawk. "We have to move," she said. "Just a little further, up to the overhang." They moved 100 yards up the creek to a small sheltered alcove where the rock hung over the sand, protecting them from the wind and the sight of the man bleeding in the creek bed. Clara set up a small camp. She spread the saddle blankets on the sand. She built a small, smokeless fire deep in the back of the alcove. Then she turned to the task she had been dreading. "I need to look at that shoulder," she said. Red Hawk lay back against the saddle. He watched her as she cut away his shirt with a knife. The wound was angry and red, but the bullet had passed through. Clara took her canteen and a clean strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. She poured water over the wound to clean it. Red Hawk hissed through his teeth, his body seizing tight, but he did not pull away. "It is clean," she murmured, her hands working quickly, efficiently. She applied a poultice of sage she had gathered earlier, pressing it against the torn flesh. She began to wrap the bandage around his chest, leaning over him. Her hair had come loose from its pins, falling like a curtain around their faces, shutting out the rest of the world. Her hands were trembling now. The adrenaline of the confrontation with Frank was fading, leaving behind a hollow, aching vulnerability. She could feel the heat of Red Hawk's skin under her fingers. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart against her palm as she secured the cloth. She tied the knot and sat back, but she did not move away. She stayed there, kneeling beside him, her hands resting on his chest. Tears, hot and unbidden, spilled over her lashes. She tried to wipe them away, ashamed of her weakness, but they kept coming. "Clara," Red Hawk whispered. She looked at him. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She felt ugly. She felt used up. She felt like a thing that had been broken and put back together wrong. She had just shot a man. She had just disowned her husband. She was a woman with no home, no name, and no future in the world she was born into. I am so tired," she choked out. "I know," he said softly. She looked into his eyes, searching for the rejection she expected. She was a white woman who had brought ruin to his door. She was the wife of a traitor. "Will you still want me?" she asked, the question barely a breath in the quiet night. It was the most terrified she had been in her entire life. Red Hawk did not answer with words immediately. He reached up with his good arm. His hand, rough and calloused, cupped the back of her neck. He pulled her down, gently but firmly, until their foreheads rested against each other. He moved his hand down, placing his palm flat against her chest, right over her heart, matching the place where her hand rested on his. "Forever," he whispered. The word was not a promise of ease. It was a vow of endurance. It was an acknowledgement that the road ahead would be hard, that they would be outcasts, that they would have to fight for every inch of peace they found, but they would do it together. Clara let out a sob that was half a laugh. She collapsed against him, burying her face in the crook of his neck. He held her, the warrior and the widow, bound together by blood and bandages under the indifferent stars of the Texas Panhandle. From that moment, the fever of the romance broke, replaced by something stronger. It was no longer a desperate attraction born of danger. It was a partnership. 2 days later, the consequences of their actions began to ripple outward. Elijah Pike, tired and terrified but driven by a newfound spine, rode into the main army fort at dawn. He did not go to the lower officers. He went straight to the colonel's quarters, demanding to be heard. He laid the telegraph log and his own written testimony on the desk. The colonel was a hard man, but he was a soldier who despised mercenaries. When he read the order signed by Crow No Survivors and saw the evidence of the dynamite, the wheels of military justice began to turn. A patrol found Silas Crow in the dry creek bed the next morning. He was half dead from blood loss and thirst, raving about a woman and a demon. He tried to offer the sergeant $1,000 to let him go. The sergeant, a man who had lost a cousin in the senseless fighting at the canyon, spat at Crow's feet and tied him to a horse. Frank Harper was not so lucky, or perhaps he was. He was never found. Some said he made it to Mexico. Others said the Comanches found him. Clara never asked, and she never looked back. The investigation was swift and brutal. The railroad company, eager to distance themselves from a public relations disaster, cut all ties with Crow. He was charged with inciting rebellion, misuse of government property, and attempted murder. But justice in the West was slow, and Clara and Red Hawk did not wait for the gavel to fall. They did not flee into the deep wilderness to hide like fugitives. That would have been an admission of guilt. Instead, they chose a harder path. They rode to the edge of the reservation territory, to a piece of land that was neither fully white nor fully Comanche. It was a hard patch of earth near a spring, a place where the boundaries were thin. Clara traded her sewing skills not for safety, but for supplies to build a cabin. Red Hawk did not hang up his bow, but he turned it toward hunting rather than war. They faced prejudice head-on. When they rode into the trading post, a different one. Miles to the east, people stared. Men spat. Women pulled their skirts aside. But Clara walked with her head high, wearing a dress made of buckskin and calico, her hand resting openly on Red Hawk's arm. She challenged them with her eyes to say a word. Few dared. There was a dangerous quiet about the couple, a sense that they had walked through fire and come out made of iron. "We do not run," Red Hawk had told her as they laid the first log of their home. "We stand. We live. That is how we win." And as the first snows of winter began to dust the plains, covering the scars of the earth in white, Clara stood in the doorway of their small, rough-hewn cabin. She watched Red Hawk breaking a colt in the corral. He moved with the animal, gentle and firm, whispering to it in the language of the wind. She touched the glass of the window. The telegraph wire hummed in the distance, miles away. It still carried lies, she was sure, but it also carried the truth she had forced into the world. She was no longer Clara May Harper, the widow who wanted peace. She was Clara, the woman who had chosen war to find love. And as Red Hawk turned and raised a hand to her, a gesture of simple, quiet acknowledgement, she knew that the hardest days were still to come, but she also knew that she would never face them alone. "Forever?" she whispered to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. The sun dipped below the horizon, setting the sky on fire one last time before the long night. But inside the cabin, the fire was lit, and it was warm. The trial of Silas Crow was not a spectacle of high rhetoric or marble halls. It took place on a makeshift platform constructed of rough-hewn pine, erected in the dusty square of the military fort, under the watchful eyes of Colonel Patterson and a jury of 6 hard-faced men. The wind blew relentlessly, snapping the flag atop the pole, a sound that served as the only gavel the proceedings required. Crow, stripped of his velvet coats and his arrogance, looked small. The bullet wound in his leg had left him with a limp, but it was the weight of the evidence that truly crippled him. The ledger book, the burnt telegraph, and the testimony of Elijah Pike, who spoke with a voice that shook but did not break, painted a picture of a man who had traded blood for right-of-way contracts. The verdict was swift. The sentence was final. Clara stood at the back of the crowd, her hand resting on the wooden railing. She did not cheer when the hood was placed over Crow's head. She did not look away when the trapdoor fell. In the West, justice was not about satisfaction. It was about sanitation. It was about removing a poison so the land could heal. "It is done," Red Hawk said, standing beside her. He wore a mixture of traditional buckskin and a heavy wool coat, a visual bridge between two warring worlds. He is dead, Clara agreed, her voice quiet. But the men he killed in the canyon are still dead. The peace he broke is still fragile. The rain washes the dust, Red Hawk said, looking at the swaying body one last time before turning his back on it. But it takes time for the grass to grow back. We have done our part. Now we must live. They left the fort before the sun set, riding away from the shadow of the gallows. They did not ride into the sunset to vanish. They rode back toward the reality they had chosen to build. 6 months later, the landscape of the Panhandle had shifted, not in geography, but in spirit. The winter had been harsh, burying the plains in drifts of white. But spring had broken with a violent, beautiful greening of the earth. Clara returned to the trading post near the crossroads. It was under new management now, a cousin of Mr. Whitaker, who had none of the old man's timidity. But Clara did not return as a seamstress begging for work. She returned as a partner. She took over the back room, but she cleared out the bolts of calico and the boxes of trinkets. She set up a long table made of polished oak. On it, she placed a fresh ledger, a stack of primers, and a slate board. She became the town's unappointed scribe and its first teacher. Every morning, before the heat rose, children from the scattered homesteads would gather. There were sons of farmers, daughters of blacksmiths, and, increasingly, children from the reservation who came with their mothers to trade. Clara taught them letters. She taught them numbers. But mostly, she taught them how to read the fine print. "Why do we have to read the contracts?" Mrs. Harper, a young boy asked one morning, his face smeared with dust. "My PA says a handshake is enough." Clara looked at him, her eyes serious but kind. "A handshake is a promise, Billy. But paper can be a weapon. If you cannot read what a man writes about you, you are fighting blind. I want you to see." She kept the trading post's books, and she did so with a transparency that terrified the dishonest and comforted the weary. Every ounce of flour, every pound of nails was recorded in ink that did not fade. She became the mediator, the woman who stood between the soldiers and the tribes, between the railroad surveyors and the ranchers. She spoke the language of the law, and she spoke the language of the truth. Red Hawk, too, had found his place. He did not cut his hair, and he did not trade his moccasins for boots. He refused to become a pet Indian for the fort or a curiosity for travelers. Instead, he became a guide and a negotiator. The army learned quickly that if they wanted to move a column through the Badlands without losing half their horses to thirst or stumbling into a misunderstanding that would lead to war, they needed Tuhuya. He knew where the water was. He knew where the Quahati were hunting. And he knew how to talk to Stonehand to ensure that boundaries were respected. He rode between the worlds, a ghost no longer, but a man of substance. He protected his people not by shooting arrows at Gatling guns, but by ensuring that the treaties were kept, that the rations were not stolen by corrupt agents, and that the lines on the map were not moved in the night. One late afternoon, as the golden hour bathed the plains in amber light, Clara stepped out onto the porch of the small cabin they had built a few miles from the post. It was a sturdy structure, half stone, half timber, built to withstand the wind. Red Hawk was in the corral, tending to a mare that had just foaled. The colt was a leggy, wobbling thing, wet and confused, blinking at the vastness of the sky. Clara walked to the fence, watching them. Red Hawk moved with a gentleness that still took her breath away. This was the hand that had held a knife to a man's throat to save her. Now, it stroked the velvet nose of a newborn horse. He looked up and saw her. A smile touched his lips, a rare expression, kept mostly for her. "He is strong," Red Hawk said. "He has the heart of a runner. He will need it," Clara said, leaning against the rail. "The world is big. We will teach him the trails," Red Hawk said. He finished with the horse and vaulted over the fence, landing softly beside her. He smelled of hay and horses and the open air. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. They walked over to a drying rack where a large buffalo hide was stretched. It was a beautiful skin, tanned to a soft cream color. "It is ready," Red Hawk said. "For what?" Clara asked. "For the mark," he replied. He dipped his hand into a bowl of red ochre paint he had mixed. Then, he pressed his open palm against the center of the hide. He signaled for Clara to do the same. She dipped her smaller hand into the paint and pressed it next to his, their fingers almost touching. The two prints distinct but aligned. "In the old way," Red Hawk said, wiping his hand on a cloth. "We marked the history of the winter on the hides, battles, famines, storms." He looked at the two red hands on the pale leather. "This is our history," he said. "Not a battle, a partnership, two hands, working." Clara touched the drying paint. It was a symbol of their life. It was not a heart pierced by an arrow. Romantic and tragic, it was a symbol of work, of agency, of the choice to build something together in a land that tried to tear things apart. "I like it," she whispered. They sat on the porch bench as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky turned a bruised purple, streaked with veins of fire. Far in the distance, a faint, rhythmic sound drifted on the wind. Click-clack, click-clack. It was the telegraph line, humming with news from the east. Prices of cotton. Election results? Gossip from New York. Once, that sound had terrified Clara. It had been the sound of Silas Crow's web tightening around her. Now, it was just a sound, like the crickets or the coyotes. "Do you ever think about him?" Clara asked suddenly. Frank Red Hawk looked at her, his profile sharp against the twilight. "The man who was my husband," Clara corrected gently. "I realize today I have forgiven him." Red Hawk raised an eyebrow. "He tried to kill you." "I do not forgive the crime," Clara said firmly. "I do not forgive the cruelty, but I forgive the past. I forgive the girl I was when I married him, the girl who thought she needed a protector, who thought safety was the only thing that mattered. I forgive Frank for being weak, because his weakness forced me to find my own strength." She looked at Red Hawk. "If he had been a better man, I never would have met you. I never would have climbed that ridge. I never would have learned to shoot." Red Hawk nodded slowly. "The storm breaks the tree, but it clears the ground for the new sapling. I do not hate him. He is a leaf blown by the wind. We are the roots." He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. The air was cooling rapidly, the desert night reclaiming the heat of the day. "The winter will be hard this year," Red Hawk noted, looking at the thickness of the horses' coats. "We have wood," Clara said. "We have flour, and we have the truth." "And we have us," Red Hawk added. He turned to face her. The scars on his shoulder had healed into jagged white lines, a map of their survival. He reached out and placed his hand flat against her chest, over her heart, just as he had done that night in the creek bed when death seemed so near. "Will you still want me?" he asked, echoing the words she had once spoken in fear, now speaking them in playful solemnity. Clara covered his hand with hers. She felt the steady rhythm of her own life beating beneath his palm. She thought of the school, the ledger, the peace they were building one day at a time. She thought of the danger that would always exist on the frontier, and the absolute certainty that she could face it. "Forever," she whispered. It was not a dramatic vow shouted into a storm. It was a quiet statement of fact. It was the promise of coffee in the morning, of mending fences in the afternoon, of reading by the fire in the evening. It was the promise to choose each other, every single day, against the odds. They sat there as the sun vanished and the first stars pricked the velvet darkness above the Texas Panhandle. The telegraph wire hummed in the distance, connecting the world. But Clara and Red Hawk needed no wire to be connected. They had the land, they had the silence, and they had the work of forever ahead of them. Thank you so much for listening to this story of the American West. I hope Clara and Red Hawk's journey touched something in you. I would love to hear where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below telling me which country or city you are tuning in from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. For more stories of romance, adventure, and the frontier, don't forget to hit the like button and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these fireside tales alive. Thank you, and I will see you on the next trail.